Welcome everyone to our continuing series about important elections around the world. And today's session is going to be about the election that took place in Chile 2 days ago on the 16th. Elections around the world. We already have the results of that election, of course. Today's session, know that is going to be the runoff election on December 10th. Chile is going to have 2 days ago at our elections around the world. The results of that election, of course. Today's session, know that when I look around the room, I see lots of familiar faces. I don't think I have to do a lot of introduction about Chile. For those of you who aren't familiar with Chile, I think the country, look around the west coast of South America. It stretches very long from north to south. It's bordered by 3 countries, by Peru, by Bolivia, and Argentina. It's very different from those 3 countries. Very long from north to south. We always have to look at things in the context of it's very different to those 3. It's thought of as a country that is very relatively stable in terms of politics. It's also thought of a country that is relatively stable in terms of economics. Thought of as a country that is relatively one of the few countries that in recent years has gotten out of the middle income bracket according to the stable the IMF. But it's a country that's had lots of issues that have gone on for many years that have been both central to politics, including Chile is one of the most equal countries in life. Lots of issues that have gone on. It has a constitution that has a long history of efforts to change that were successful in the last government. And there are new issues that have come up that were prominent in the last election about So I think that's about all of the introduction that I have to give. We have 3 terrific speakers today. Lisa Walker on my left. Lisa is a lawyer, been here in Washington for the last 2 years. She has her own law firm in Chile. She's been active in Chilean politics. She's worked in the Ministry of Lawyer about women and gender, and she was a candidate for one of the positions in the Constitutional Convention on my left. She's worked after Lisa speaks, lawyer first will be speaking. She was a candidate here, no Eric, because he was the founding position of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies here at Maryland University. And before that, he was for many years the director of the Social Science Research Council of Latin American and Caribbean program here at Maryland University. And finally, Michael Shifter, many years here is very familiar with Social Science University. Michael was an officer with the Ford Foundation. He spent time living in Chile for many years, and he was the very familiar emeritus director of the Inter-American Dialogue, connected to the Inter-American Dialogue here in Chile. And I've asked each of the speakers to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we can perhaps have some dialogue among the speakers, and then lots of time for question and answers. So Lisa, I've asked each of the speakers to go first for about 10 minutes, and then we can have some dialogue among the speakers,
for the invitation.
Question and answers.
Pleasure.
So Lisa, I've asked each of the speakers to go first for about 10 minutes.
Please tell me when the 10 minutes are done. So I'm gonna do a brief introduction about the election that took place this last Sunday. We had 3 elections. So I'm gonna tell election, but also the parliamentarian election. And I think both elements are connected. And it is important to give both election, but also what was and it was that it was the first time for a long time that we had mandatory vote. So that what in the result that you can see that in the presidential and also in the parliamentary election there were votes. So that in the result that you can see here that in the presidential years ago there was like silence that nobody knew if we were gonna be there regarding the election, and that shows in a way last Sunday. Regarding the result with the parliament. So we will have regarding onward a very strong right parliament in terms that the House of Representatives, the majority of the House of Representatives will have members from the right, and in the Senate, in terms that a draw it's like sensitive, the majority people that comes from the right will find the right from other parties. That's important because as you can see regarding the presidential election, we have other candidates. One is a very strong right candidate, José Antonio Cast, and the other one is for the first time a convention, we have Janet Jara. So it is important who runs the presidential
but also who has the support in the National Congress. In the Congress, there are lots of parties that will disappear because of the election. Small countries that small parties that didn't manage to have the minimum amount of votes or people elected in order to keep their presence in the Congress. And if we check who are these political parties, we realize that they all come from the center right, center left, but from the center. So not only we will have a Congress that has more presence from the right wing, but also a Congress that is more polarized. Partido Radical, Evópolis, Demócratas, Amarillos, Regionalistas, Verdes Sociales, they will all disappear, and these were political parties that you never really know who they're gonna support on a social program or in a bill discussion, because they were not properly from the left or properly from the right. So polarization, which is an international phenomenon, it's not only abroad, but it's also to Chile. So we will have a more polarized National Congress, and we have a more polarized, as I was saying before, presidential election. The two candidates that came to the second round, José Antonio Cast and Janet Jara, they are not from the center. José Antonio Cast used to be part of a right-wing political party, UDI, but he created his own political party, the Republicanos, in order to be the toughest, the most extreme version of the right 4 years ago. Now he has his own competition with Kaiser, who was also a candidate of the presidency that didn't make it to the second round. On the other hand, we have Janet Jara, that she's a communist, and I have to make that point because that is one of the main elements I would say about this election. Like, are you willing to go to vote for a communist? She's not within the Communist Party a very radical person. She says to herself that she's like more social, democratic person, but still she's a member of the Communist Party, and especially, of course, the candidates from the right wing makes a huge point about that factor. So even if she tries to balance her program, her political and social ideas, being part of the Communist Party, it's something that is in the center of the discussion. We have a third candidate that didn't make it to the second round this Sunday, who is Parisi, but he's very important to put into the conversation. Parisi, he's a well-known economist in Chile. He was living in the US until some months ago. He had been living in the US for the last years. He, like his slogan during the his candidacy was "Ni fachos ni comunachos." which means like I don't like the right and I don't like communist or the left. So he considers himself as someone more free, individual, less traditional or conventional about political structures. And he got the third place in the election. The first one was Janet Jara, the communist candidate. The second one was José Antonio Cast. They were almost tied, which was a surprise. Janet Jara had 26% support of the votes. José Antonio Cast had 24% of the votes, so it's very similar. The government has 30%, no, 28%, 30% of support. So the communist candidate had less support of what the government has. So that was also a big surprise. But Parisi had almost 20% of the votes. So we have now a 20% of the vote of people that it seems to be that supports the idea that I don't vote for the left or for the right. I vote for my liberty, my economic stability. So these 20% of the votes are going to be crucial in order to see who is going to be at the end of the day the next president of Chile. And that 20% of the vote, it is relevant because if you get together the three candidates that we had from the right wing in this election, who was José Antonio Cast, Kaiser, and Evelyn Matei, the three of them managed to have a 50.2% of the total votes of the election of last Sunday. So if the people that supported them maintain their vote in order to support José Antonio Cast, it is expected, or say it is probably that we will have José Antonio Cast as the next president. But these persons around Parisi that do not identify with this traditional spectrum of politics could change this scenario and could give some surprises at the end of the day. I want to maybe finish, I don't know how many minutes. Okay, like my last 30 seconds. I want to finish talking about who were not in the election last Sunday. So who didn't make it? There were two important candidates. Evelyn Matei, who is a right-wing traditional, let's put it that way, politician. She was member of the parliament. She was Ministry of Labor. She was leading Providencia, the Council of Providencia. She got the 5th place last Sunday. So that says a lot about how traditional politics work, in the sense that probably she was the most capable candidate in terms of experience for the right wing, but she was unable to connect with the citizens. And on the other hand, we had Janet Jara. We had only one clear, more strong candidate from the left wing, who was Janet Jara, because there was an election before. And who was the most important competitor of Janet Jara, or we thought she was? It was Carolina Toa. Who would be like, in a mirror, we could put like Evelyn Matei and Carolina Toa. They are very different, of course, in their political thoughts, but they have common grounds in terms that they have a long career in politics and a lot of experience in politics, but again, none of them make it on their own elections. So I think that not only Chile is more polarized because of this election, but also the way you see politics is changing, because traditional politics, and it's not only Chile, we could talk about the US also in these terms, the way traditional politics is valued is also changing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. I'll turn to Eric now.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Lou, for the invitation. And it's great to see lots of good friends and many students from here at SIS. So I would start actually with the opening point that Elisa made, which was that this was an election that had obligatory voting, which hadn't been the case in many, many years. And so there was a fair amount of uncertainty going in as to how accurate the polling was going to be. And it turns out, for the most part, I think the polling was quite accurate. It underreported the support for Parisi. And that actually reflects the segment of the electorate that hadn't been polled traditionally. It seems that those who have in recent decades not voted, chose not to vote, tended to be one, toward the right, but two, tended to be very skeptical of politics and politicians, rejecting everything that is, and being very open to the kind of argument, I'm not for one of the sides or for the other side. But aside from the fact that that's where the formerly abstaining vote went, pretty much the outcome was consistent with the polling. I think if there were a particular, I think there were two things that didn't happen. One was that Kaiser, who ran even further to the right of the extreme rightist Jose Antonio Cast, in the last days, in the last polls of the campaign, was spiking a bit. And in the end, he topped out at, I think it was around 13%. And Cast had a clear lead on the right side of the political spectrum. The other thing that was noteworthy was that Jara didn't get more than 26%, when, as Elisa pointed out, the government that she would be associated with, for which she was in a sense the continuity candidate, is unpopular, but makes it into the 30s. Jara only got 26. And to me, what that tells us, one of the things it tells us is that the communist label mattered, but also that she has no chance whatsoever in the second round. And I don't know whether we agree on that, but my sense is even if some of Parisi's vote would go to Jara because it would be dissatisfied with such a hard right candidate as Cast, and even if some of the youth vote, which interestingly went very hard right, if some of the youth vote is turned off by Cast's opposition to same-sex marriage, by his extreme position with regard to birth control and so on, even if that's the case, you add up the votes on the right side of the political spectrum, and it's pretty clear Cast wins this election, barring some cataclysmic, difficult to model event. I think it's useful to place this election in the context of the current government. I agree with Elisa that what stands out about this election is the polarization. But if you go back 4 years, it's also the case that the runoff was a polarized election. Cast, this time the overwhelming favorite, seen as so extreme right, so as to be unacceptable for much of the center, that chose to support Gabriel Boric, an untested, very young, for some centrists perceived as a radical alternative, radical coming in the aftermath of the social explosions of 2019, an intense wave of protests in which youth in particular expressed a disgust, a dismay with the course that democracy had taken over the nearly 30-year period, in which Pinochet's constitution remained in effect. And the outcome of that social explosion in the fall of 2019 was that the conservative government at the time of Sebastián Piñera agreed to open a process to generate a new constitution. And Boric is elected in that polarized election, in which he is seen as the person who can resolve the tensions articulated in the estallido, in the social explosion, and as the person who's not so extreme as Cast. But the constitutional reform process gets bungled, and I won't go into details, but twice it fails. Once it fails because the left terribly mishandles it, at which point the Boric government becomes a lame duck and ineffective for the remainder of the administration, thus with popularity at around 30 or so percent, which is what Jara inherited and suffered from. But you now, and then Cast and the Republicanos lead a second constitutional process that again, like the first, gets rejected by the electorate, which sees it as too radically right-wing. And yet here we are a couple years later with that radical right-wing coming out in front on the first round, and I think destined to get a solid majority in the second round. So I think putting this election in the context of those tensions of the last 4 years, 5 years, 6 years since the estallido, helps us to contextualize where we are and helps us to grasp why it's so remarkable that a candidate as extreme as Cast is in the position that he's in. Let me just conclude with one point about how will he be able to govern? And 3 reflections. One is, I think it is very important that the Senate is split. And there, it's not clear to me whether Parisi's votes may turn out to be a sort of a swing block in the parliament, in the legislative branch. And that could be quite relevant for the degree to which Cast is able to carry out a really right-wing program. I was in a webinar with Cast's principal economic advisor several days ago, and he emphasized that the agenda is less government, less regulation, less taxes. And we're going to immediately cut 5% of GDP from public spending. That when 83% of public spending is mandated by law. So where they're going to find that 5%, I don't know. But he said, we know where it is and we're not going to say what it is because that's tactical. But as soon as we get in, we're going to cut 5%. I'm not clear that they have an electoral majority for that, right? And there have been times when the Chilean right has been able to accomplish things like that, but not under democracy. And Cast may say that if Pinochet were a candidate, he would vote for him, but he's not, and it's democracy now. And whether they're going to be able to pull off that kind of governance is not clear to me. The one other thing I will say, this election campaign was overwhelmingly about security, the sense of rampant crime and insecurity, and about migration putatively responsible for crime and insecurity. There were moments in the campaign where I was reminded of Trump's narratives about American carnage, right? And it doesn't matter whether in fact society is a war zone. If you say it enough times and you scream enough about it, a substantial portion of electorates will vote as if you're operating in an environment of extreme insecurity. And the fact that the campaign was about insecurity and about migration, rather than, as last time, about inclusion, meant that the outcome was essentially foretold.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. I'll turn to Michael Shifter. Michael?
Great. Thank you, Lou. It's great to be here. It's great to be see such so many friends, old friends, don't get insulted, but some of us remember something called the Christian Democratic Party, but you'd have to do a forensic exercise to try to figure out where that party is, but we really go way back. But no, thank you very much. It's great to be here with Lisa and Eric. Couple of things, couple of points, and also sort of responding a little bit to what's been said already, a lot of which I agree with. First of all, this is the second round everybody, I think, expected. So in that sense, It's not a big surprise. I mean, anybody who's following this back to the second round between Hara and Cast. I think the big surprise was that Hara didn't get the support that many people thought, which would be at least 30%, which would make her conceivably, although it wouldn't be easy, competitive in the second round on December 14th. And I agree largely with Eric that it's one should be humbled by election results all over the world and not be too certain about one's predictions these days, given the uncertainties. But it seems hard to imagine a scenario that Hara defeats Cast in the second round. And I take some credit for a headline in the Latin American Advisor in the Inter-American Dialogue today, which I suggested to the editor. I said this would be a good title, which is the die cast for the right wing in Chile's election? But anyway, now, you know, in some ways you could look at this election. This fits into the sort of the alteration of power in Chile, which we've seen, with the exception of Lagos and Bachelet. There's been kind of a turn to, you know, to Piñera twice and Eduardo Frei and so forth. This kind of fits that pattern. I think the question is Cast kind of a different an animal, a different political phenomena, and does this put Chile on quite a different path? And I think that's kind of the fundamental question that hangs all over this. You know, who is Cast? Is he a Democrat or is he not a Democrat? He has very complicated views about the Pinochet dictatorship, generated a lot of controversy. He says a lot of different things that one just has to kind of sort of analyze that. I don't think it's entirely clear. He sort of claims that he is a Democrat, small d Democrat. But I think that's a big question that overhangs all of this. I think the lesson, as was said, was that Hara, I think, was a good candidate. She was a good communicator. And as Lisa said, the congressional vote outperformed her at the presidential level. But she had a ceiling, and I think for two reasons. One, being a member of the Communist Party, which still matters. Although I have to say, as a person that I think all of us knows in this room, named Sergio Bitar, who's a well-respected Chilean political figure and analyst, who wrote to me, and he said to me he was surprised by the relative indifference to her being a member of the Communist Party among many sectors in Chile. I think it mattered for a lot of people who were my generation, maybe less so for younger Chileans. And he was struck that it was not as significant as he would, at least among a certain demographic in Chile. You know, Cold War is over. That's kind of not the new reality. And I think, you know, one could see parallels in the United States as well, where socialism has a different meaning for people of a certain generation versus younger people. So I think there's something there, but still it mattered enough that it was kind of a real problem. And of course, the second reason why she had a ceiling was that she was associated with a government that was not popular, the Boric government, and that was huge problem. And no matter how she tried to do it, she couldn't separate herself and dissociate herself from government. She was a minister of labor in that government. So it was very, 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 very hard to do that. And there was this, as Eric said, I think I would highlight this even more, you know, there were the two key issues of crime, immigration, and Boric kind of struggled with those issues. And I don't share the view that they was kind of manufactured in the sense that if you say something long enough, I think people really perceived that these were huge issues for Chile, which sort of were associated with disorder, with chaos. And but you're right, the objective data, I mean, Chile has, I think, 6 homicides per 100,000. The regional average is 20 per 100,000. So objectively, it's not nearly what other countries are, most countries are in Latin America. But the perception was completely that this was, because there was sort of very high profile, highly visible incidents, dramatic incidents of crime that create fear. And it's not because there was sort of, politicians take advantage of that, and they did that. And in that sense, I agree. But that just happened. That happened. That's the way it happens. People become very concerned. And those were issues that had just were very, I think, Boric was slow to get to those issues and get a handle on those issues. And I think that was costly for his presidency. In addition to this, to the Constitution, and where he really bet a lot on the new Constitution, and that didn't work out. And that brings me to, I think, an interesting puzzle or paradox in this. On the one hand, you do have this, you could say Chile is very polarized. And because, you have communist, candidate of the Communist Party, you have somebody who is certainly has some sympathy for Pinochet, very hard line to the right and so forth. But at the second time, you had an election where both of these candidates really moderated considerably, moved to the center considerably. You had two efforts to redo the Constitution, both of which failed, and really revealed that Chile is a pretty centrist country at the end of the day. The hard left proposal was rejected. Then the right had its proposal and it was rejected. And so that suggests maybe there's not, that there's polarization at some levels, but in other aspects, I think there's less polarization and it's more of a kind of a centrist, moderate country. And I think the campaign forced that. And Cass ended up, thanks to people like Kaiser, who are much harder right, he ended up sounding like, I don't know, a pretty reasonable, moderate guy. And it was, when you heard his proposals on how to tackle the crime and insecurity issue, it sounded pretty commonplace and pretty well accepted by a lot of Chileans. So I think it's, there's polarization, but there's also a kind of there's kind of a reassuring kind of centrism and moderation and pragmatism that I think came through this campaign. When Cast was a candidate against Boric, and 4 years ago, he came to the Inter-American Dialogue. I had a long conversation with him. He was certainly very, very different in this campaign than he was 4 years ago. I mean, he really highlighted a lot of his positions on social issues, on gay marriage, on abortion, and so forth. And, he was he knew that if he drove home those issues, he would drive a lot of people away on social issues in Chile. And so I think there was a contrast that I noted. I mean, this was a private meeting, but I can tell you that he certainly, what I heard in that meeting 4 years ago was, I think, much more radical than what I heard on the campaign trail. And obviously he learned some lessons and he knew how to accommodate, and reach out to a broader electorate. So he kind of really suppressed some of those more hardline views, especially on the center. In any event, I think Cast is going to have a hard time governing, and he's going to have a hard time within the right. He has, as Elisa pointed out, he has all these different political forces and parties in the right. They're all kind of on different positions. And he's going to have to really, manage all that and try to form alliances to get anything through. And I think that's going to be very, very difficult for him. I'm not sure there's going to be right now. There's, of course, they've all come together and they all support him. But after in March, you may see some strains within the sort of broad coalition. The other thing that I would say, wrap up here is, maybe we should reconsider kind of, there clearly, there is a right-left dimension to it, but there's also just the regular, repudiation of a government that's not performing well and that's not popular. And it's notable that the same day as the Chilean election, Sunday, there was a repudiation of the president of Ecuador in a national referendum, who's somebody on the right, you could argue on the right, more conservative, not Daniel Noboa. And there's a sense of desgaste, and people, if they're not happy, they vote against the government. And it's not because there's a change in ideological posture as such. We've seen it in this country, a year ago, Trump wins, and because people aren't happy with the current government of Biden. And, 2 weeks ago, there's a repudiation of Trump. A year later, and the Democrats win all over. And, is the country moving to the left now compared to a year ago? Well, I guess you could argue that, but you could also just say, people aren't happy. They reject. It's a rejectionist trend, not an ideological trend. I mean, that's another way to kind of frame it and understand it, I think. And then just, finally, I would say, that, inevitably, all these comparisons are going to be made. Will Cass be another Bukele? Will he be another Malay? Will he be, I mean, there's a certain like-mindedness with that group, but he's just, I would be very cautious about that. He's a very different phenomenon. He's very much a product of Chile. He's not going to do, and he can't do what Bukele has done in El Salvador on the crime issue. It makes absolutely no sense. Makes no sense that he'll do what Malay is doing in Argentina. It's a very, very difficult situation. So I'd just be a little bit careful about sort of jumping to that. I know how tempting that is to do that, but it's not. And then the final thing, leaving aside left, right, Chile, at the end of the day, there is a value of being an institutionalist. And I think Chile is still a very institution-minded country. I think it still prides its institution, even though the old political forces, as you said, with Carolina Toa and Mate have been rejected. I think there's also, it's not going to go, I don't think, and maybe I'm being naive or too optimistic. I don't think this is going to go off the rails. I think it's going to stay with certain parameters that we've seen in Chile, although with new players and new proposals, new politics. Thanks.
Thank you. I have to pick up this theme of rejectionism because it's not only happened with respect to Ecuador and others, but it's also happened in the Southern Cone. Milei's election in Argentina is, I think, another example of rejectionism. And I have to mention Rodrigo Paz in Bolivia because Rodrigo Paz has his undergraduate degree from SIS. I signed his graduation diploma. When he was an undergraduate, he certainly wasn't an extreme individual. His father had a particular history within Bolivia overall. But I want to push Elisa about this issue that you raised initially about Chile being polarized. And I wonder if the right term to use is polarized or if it's a divided government. And if a divided government causes problems for Chile being able to move ahead with the kind of agenda that it wants to move. I mentioned in the beginning that Chile is the country in Latin America that's avoided the middle income trap. It's the one country that the IMF says has more than 40% of GDP per capita compared to the United States, which is only at 41%. If there's a divided government, it will be hard to move programs ahead. Is there a chance that there can be some kind of a coherent program that evolves within the context of caste? Or is this a problem that continues to linger with Chile?
A divided government, it's not gonna be a new phenomenon in Chile. For instance, Michelle Bachelet, in her second period, she didn't have the majority of the National Congress in order to do any legal change, and she did a lot. So I think it's not only that it's divided, that it's gonna be for sure, but the political parties that are represented in the National Congress, they present themselves as more extreme parties. Especially, we will have a new party now, which is the Johannes Kaiser Party, el Nacional Libertario, Partido Nacional Libertario, who are at the right wing of the Republicanos. So probably they will try to show their identity. And sometimes in politics, the identity shows when you manage to distinguish yourself from the rest. And if we will have a government, probably of José Antonio Cast, I agree on that. Although you have to wait until the election, maybe the Partido Nacional Libertario will have to show their own cards in order to look at the following presidential elections in 4 years' time. So I think it's gonna be more polarized. And also, we had right-wing presidents before, but Piñera was a very particular one. He was not supported, he never supported Pinochet. He voted for no. He was a very deep believer in democracy. I wouldn't say that about José Antonio Cast. This would be if he manages to be the president. It will be the first time since the recovery of democracy that we have a president that openly supports Pinochet and the coup d'etat. That's a different reality for Chile. Like there were boundaries in the Chilean political discussion. I think this is a different level about it. And I would like to make the point, if you don't mind, it is about this idea of Kast being a reasonable guy. I think he has managed to get like to not talk too much about his own political idea in this election, and maybe that's why he got such a good result with the 24% of the votes. But he has been talking all the time about emergency. Like I don't think he would close the National Congress. He doesn't have the force in order to do that. But I think that a candidate that presents his social, economic, cultural programs based on emergency crisis, Chile, it's like falling down and we have to recover it from the worst. I don't think that's like a reasonable guy. And also, it has been interesting from the point of view of the right wing, how the team of Evelyn Matei was all the time criticizing José Antonio Cast, saying like, you're not being serious about your promises. Like you're saying you're gonna cut $5,000 million of the public budget within 18 months. And Ignacio Briones, who was like kind of the chief or the face of the economic program of Evelyn Matei, was saying that's not possible. So you're not being faithful to your promises. Or José Antonio Cast is saying like, I'm gonna stand back, talking about migration, which has been one of the main topics, security, migration, and efficiency for the state. José Antonio Cast promises that he will send back 300,000 migrants during the first month of his government, and that each migrant will buy their own ticket in order to go back to their countries. I love how you laugh, because I think it's like it is very like sensationalist. Like it looks like amazing, but like how are you gonna make it? Like they will go voluntary to their countries, they will pay their tickets in order to make it. So I wonder, all the Venezuelans that are in Chile or the people from Haiti that are in Chile, like, are they gonna pay their tickets? Are they gonna go back to their countries? I humbly doubt it. So this idea of the reasonable guy, I think that more reasonable than the last election. Like about the valoric agenda, he hasn't said a word. He says Chile is an emergency. We shouldn't discuss about those matters. But we have the experience of the Consejo Constitucional, where those matters were at the center of the discussion. So I wonder, like, if this silence, it's only a tactic for the election, but when he gets into the La Moneda, our palace, maybe that mouth will open and that silence will stay only for the election.
Great, thank you so much. We have about 45 minutes left, which is the time I wanted to be sure we have for questions. We have a microphone here that people can come up to and pose a question. Or I can just call on people. Alice, do we need to have people speak to the microphone, or can you can hand it to them? Okay. Who would like to ask the first question? Please identify yourself.
Hi there, my name is Juan Bielsa. I'm an IEPA student here. I'm from Spain, but I lived in Chile from 2019 to anyways. So first of all, I have two small questions. The first one is, what do you think has been the difference between other countries in the South Cone of South America, with how, for example, if you look at Argentina, the Libertarian Party suddenly appeared and it rushed over the elections, and we have Javier Milei as the president, which, like, looking a few years back, he was talking with like small little libertarian speakers of Chile and some other regions, like Axel Kaiser. in conferences where very few people go to, and suddenly he becomes the president of Argentina, and how that hasn't happened in Chile. Well, we have a strong libertarian party. He's third, or is it maybe like a charisma thing, or is it maybe something that hasn't really gone so deep into the population with the past of like the privatization of certain things in the country? And second, what is the possibility of second, because as much as I think that Chile is one of the countries that is very much institutionalized to the region, we can look back in 2019, and when I went there in June, I remember seeing the government of Sebastián Piñera and looking at the country and being like, wow, this is an amazing, very stable place. And from one month to the other, suddenly we all are experiencing quarantine before the pandemic comes. Streets are burning, everything is closed. And while things have gotten better, a lot of that past and experiences from the estallido are still noticeable today. And I think that's partly what the reason of security is. So what do you think that this might be happening in the future again? Maybe a second estallido, or do you think that just people are like tired of like years of protests? And
Eric, would you like that?
So first on the comparison with Argentina, I mean, Milei comes into office and, well, is elected in a context of economic catastrophe. And the sense of dislocation that those Argentine levels of inflation and of macroeconomic policy dysfunction produce are very different from what one finds in Chile today. Having said that, and you know, acknowledging Lou's point that Chile has, by the account of the multilaterals, made it into high income status, has escaped the middle income trap. Leave aside the terminology, I don't think that most Chileans feel that it has. And I think that both Cara and Kast's campaigns emphasized a target of achieving 4% growth rates by the end of their term, when over the past decade, average growth has been around 2% a year, which is half of what it was in the first 20 years of democracy. And so there's a very widespread sense of economic frustration, of a sense that the cost of living is beyond what people can handle, that the costs of basic services, including health and education, are prohibitive. And that makes people, this is part of the context of the rejecting those who are in power from whatever side they might be, right? You know, I think that it is noteworthy that Kast did not emphasize the social positions in this campaign. And I don't know what happens if he comes in and starts pushing a reactionary cultural project. If he comes in and tries to cut 5% of GDP from the budget, I don't know what kind of popular response that elicits. I also think it's true, it's not clear that with this legislature, he's going to be able to get very far with those positions. But I think that certainly the experience of the estallido, the 2019 social explosion, tells us that there is potential for outrage in Chilean society, right? So there's a great deal of uncertainty about what things are going to look like a couple of years from now. Having said that, you know, I'm reminded the book that many of you will know, the Levitsky and Ziblatt's How Democracies Die. And the first way they die is that they elect people who aren't Democrats, right? And if somebody gets elected who's not a Democrat, that's dangerous, no matter how strong your institutions, right? My take on the US was that the US could do it once, but if it did it a second time, the institutions couldn't hold, right? This is the first time, well, question mark, is this the first time? Certainly, I strongly agree that Piñera was a small d Democrat, absolutely. And I think now that's very much in question with this new government, likely incoming government.
Um, This gentleman in the black t-shirt.
Okay,
You're next and then.
okay, thank you very much. I'm Ursula Indacochea from the Due Process of Law Foundation. I have a question for Lisa. And my question is whether you think if Gus got elected, he's gonna move forward like as happened, for example, in Peru with the pardon of Fujimori, if he's gonna move forward with the pardon to the perpetrator of human rights violations during the dictatorship, and whether you think that could be an issue right now in Chile. No, because with all the militarization of the agenda of public security in the region, this is more than symbolic. This has to do with gaining the military to your side just in case of protest and chaos. So I was wondering if that could be an issue in Chile.
Lisa, could you answer?
Yes, I can. So it is interesting to realize how human rights it's an important matter on the Chilean debate. I think that one of the elements, maybe I have no basis for this comment. It's like a personal thought. Like one of the elements that maybe limited the possibility of people from the center to vote for Evelyn Matei was how she started saying that el plan de búsqueda de detenidos desaparecidos was a revenge, not a serious public policy. So human rights are important, and Cast has been very openly in line with Kaiser that he could pardon all the human rights perpetrators, as you were saying. And I think those are factors that creates tension within the country. I don't think the citizens in Chile are indifferent about these matters. They want security, they want stable economy, but they care about their own history. I would like to think. So if that happens, I think that would create some tension within the country. And thinking about human rights also, and think about estallido social. One difference that Cast had in comparison with Piñera was that he thought that Piñera was too naive or not tough enough in order to control the estallido social. And probably on that phenomenon, if Cast would have been the president, we have no doubts that he would have taken the military forces and asked to be more tough, which Piñera didn't do. From a human rights perspective also, I think that his relation with the military forces are gonna be more tension because maybe he will require more about them in order to have control. If we have any, I don't know, estallido social too, or social tensions within the streets.
So Alice, you have indicated just, we'll go next after her, this guy with the black t-shirt, and then Mark Schneider in front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Stella de la Paz. I'm a graduate student here at SIS. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to go to Georgetown for a panel that actually covered the subject of the gap between winning and governing. One of the panelists brought the fact that Latin America is very known for having multiple political parties, and they also call them disposable parties. You guys mentioned about having the potential new party between Cast and Johannes. So I was wondering what your take was on the new term of disposable parties and the actual effectiveness in the winner's governance after this very polarized election. Thank you.
The result that Kaiser managed to have in the National Congress is amazing. He got 8 places in the House of Representatives and 1 place in the Senate. So he has a very strong force now within the National Congress. How long are they gonna last? We don't know. And that's why I think that maybe they will try to keep some distance with Cast, though the Kaiser already supported Cast openly. But maybe within the National Congress, they will try to create their own identity in order to project their own survivance. But we have, talking about disposable parties, we had, as I said before, lots of small parties that lasted 2, 3, 4 years, and now they will disappear. Amarillos, Demócratas, Regional, Social, Verde. So that scenario is changing a lot within the National Congress, and the Partido de la Gente, which is the party of Parisi, who doesn't say ni facho ni comunacho, as I said before, they tend to vote right. It's interesting because they said they are not part of the right, but when they are already in the National Congress, and if you check their positions within the discussions, they almost all the time go to the right. So then maybe we will not have that much surprises within the parliament.
This gentleman here.
Thank you for my name is Kyle Smith, IAPA first year grad student. Thank you for hosting the panel. So my question had to deal with, in 2022, I remember Italy had an election and Meloni won, and I remember everyone was freaking out about she's a fascist, Mussolini's back, it's bad. And I feel like she's like quite moderated. And then I look at Trump in 2024, and people were freaking out, and I feel like he's kind of doubled down a little bit on his pseudo-fascist lean. My question is, assuming Cost wins the election, do you think he's going to moderate like Meloni, or is he going to double down and be more like how he was in 2021?
I mean, I think if he doubles down, he's in big trouble. He may double down, but he'll, a year from now, it will be a government will have 20 or 30% support what Boric has today. I mean, it's that simple. It won't work. That's kind of my point. I think one talks about was somebody a Democrat or not a Democrat. You have to put it in some context. I mean, I'm not sure Nixon was a Democrat, but is Petro a Democrat? I mean, let's go through the region. Is Cast another Bolsonaro? Is he the same as Bolsonaro? I mean, I'm just raising questions. This is, it's easy to talk about it in a very kind of general way, but he's got to, assuming that he wants to be a successful president, if he doubles down and he radicalizes, that's a recipe for failure. He'll be a failure. I mean, that I could say with some confidence in Chile. Again, going back, the Chileans overwhelmingly rejected the rightist proposal for a constitutional overhaul. He moderated in this, and who's the real Jose Antonio Cast? I mean, there's an article today in America's Quarterly by somebody many of you will recognize, Michael Reed, who was the editor of The Economist. He said he had a long conversation with Cast. He said, I came away thinking he's a Democrat, he's definitely conservative. Maybe, well, that would be proven wrong. Who knows? But the context matters. I just think in Chile, if he, begins to govern that way, I think he won't succeed. That's, I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not Chilean, and at least thinks differently, but I think that will be, and then a year from now, he'll be, the people will be looking for another alternative.
One thing on that, during the campaign, Cost went and visited Meloni and went for the photo op, and definitely wanted to associate his offer with that brand.
Mark Schneider. And I suppose, let me just say that the first time that I went to Chile was to investigate the prisons under Pinochet in 1974. And since then, I've been engaged with Chile throughout. My concern about Cast is that he appears, given his father, the fascist nature of his views in the past, that the possibility exists that once he gets into office, and I agree with everything that's been said, if something happens, Eric talked about if he takes action, for example, a 5% cut, starts to reduce or remove social services, social benefits, there's a reaction in the streets. And it's at that point that the caste that I'm worried about would come out by sending the military and the police, and at that point, I suspect right-wing armed militia against them. That would be the point at which I would worry that he's not really a Democrat, and beyond that, that he is a fascist. So that's one. The other is, I really appreciate your view about what happened to the center, what happened to the Christian Democratic Party, what happened to PPD in terms of they're disappearing in this, at least in this election. Those are two very different questions, but I appreciate it. Amen.
Would you like to answer?
Yeah, well, I share your thoughts in the sense that the street is the main concern. And if Cast is coherent with what he has been saying for the past 4 and more years, 7 years, about having the control of the streets no matter what, that could create a huge problem within the country. And talking about the center, it is difficult to give an answer, but I think also the identities of the parties are changing. Frente Amplio has an important representation in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. They were seems to be more rupturist when they arrived to power. Now I think they're more conventional. So also the center is maybe the faces are changing, not necessarily disappearing. I have my own thoughts. I said it was more polarized, so I have to be coherent also with my own thoughts. But on the other hand, maybe there is a renovation of generations, and I think this government with Gabriel Boric, you can see the difference within their own voice. Like the first year is completely different from the year that we have been living, the last one, about their rhetoric, their interests, their value about the history, their value about stability, about economic growth that they never talk about it, like really before they were in the government. So I think it's interesting to see how it's changing. And I want to say a point about communism. You said, Michael, that there is a generational gap about communism, and I think there are Camila Vallejos, Cal Cariola, they are communists, and they are a reference for the, I was going to say new generations, not that new now, maybe 35, 40 years old. And they're communists, and they have had an amazing political career. And I think for them, you cannot, maybe you will not agree with their own political ideas, but communism, it's not like a trademark that creates a rejection. So for the future years, the center, let's see how it goes, but also this idea of maybe a democratic left communist party will manage to arise, because within the Communist Party in Chile, you have different forces also. You have a presidential who is very traditional, more Leninist communism. Camila Vallejos, Carcariola, they are not Leninist at all. So let's see how it develops.
To add on to that, Jeanette Hara became the nominee of the alliance because she ran an entirely different political campaign. She used Facebook in ways that no Chilean politician had before, and she projected herself as Tia Jeanette, like the ante of the whole country. So it's possible for innovations to take place within political parties and to change the way politics goes. But I want to put forward another scenario besides this one that you put forward, Mark, about having an emergency and calling the military out, because there is a different political pattern in another important country in Latin America, and that's Mexico, where the executive and the legislature and the judicial are all controlled by the same party. And whether they're doing that because they can't break the inequality in Mexico and they feel they have to control all three and they're eventually democratic, or whether it's authoritarian, is an interesting question. It's a question we should all be asking. And how did that come to pass? Well, there were changes in the national legislation that allowed people to be reelected within the legislature and for the legislatures to be replaced all at one time. And then the AMLO claimed that he had the election stolen from himself. And for 6 years, he traveled all over the country, treating people with dignity and changing the way the base voted for him. And once he got into power, he continued to do that and structured things so the judiciary could eventually come over. Now that's a democratic process that ended up with not a divided government like we've had in Chile for a very long time. And I'm wondering if anything like that might happen in Chile. I'm sure that this is one of the issues that national leaders have. It's not just how can they govern, but how can they continue their project beyond their 4 years or beyond their 6 years? And here in the United States, that's something that we're focusing on. So I don't know if anyone can answer or comment on what I've just said, but there is another model that's out there. So Kathy Schneider, and then this gentleman in the white shirt.
I think that the left is much more divided than it appears. That is, I think there's been a shift back towards an institutional left, that the Communist Party is actually an institution. If you compare it to Frente Amplio and Boric and the student movement and the Estallido, which is all a rebellion against institutions and parties. And the Constitution wasn't really a left-wing Constitution. I always thought that Constitution could have been written by my undergrad students. Really, and I, was in the Poblaciones during that period, and Poblaciones all voted against the so-called left-wing Constitution because they didn't see it as a pro-labor, pro-poor people, pro-neighborhood. And at that neighborhood level, issues like crime and drugs do really matter because good friends of mine, their children are addicted. The neighborhoods, people move out of neighborhoods to protect their kids from getting involved in things. So the crime issue at that level is different than for those people who don't live in poor, high crime neighborhoods, imagine it to be. And what they wanted in those neighborhoods was not a constitution that said it was by multi-gender, plurinational, they didn't know what it meant to them, right? They did worry about things like abolishing the Senate, which never made any sense to anyone. But what you see with Jata is she was Minister of Labor, right? She is speaking directly to working class. She's talking about reviving, the labor movement. And that is not a new estallido. That's a different form of protest that I think would be used against cops. And I must say there's no party in Chile that would be more upset about an amnesty to human rights violators in the past than the Communist Party. They would definitely take an action, and I don't think it would be estallido because they're experienced organizers. They were very experienced during the military dictatorship. At least that's what my guess is. Chile may be very different than the Chile I know. I've visited since my real experiences during the dictatorship.
Not only the Communist Party, the Socialists, the PPD, o sea, the Pinochet regime is still painful. And it's not only like an institutional, it feels, the pain it feels. So I think would be a common rejection. What we have been talking a lot about caste and what is the program of caste? We know it's security, immigration, efficiency, but what is Janet Jara talking about? She says, well, how can you make it at the end of to the end of the month? And as you pointed out, she's not talking about Mapuches, trans, gender. She's talking about having food on the table, having health. And I think that's a very interesting shift in says, but though it's interesting, you don't see a huge support on the votes on the other hand. So is it still elitist or not? Well, the election will say.
Next is this gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Gustavo. I'm a graduate student here. I'm Brazilian, but I grew up in Uruguay, so I'm really interested in everything that goes on in South America. My question is mostly, I'm glad you guys brought out rejectionism as a trend and how it's pretty much what's happening in Chile right now. Do you guys see this being replicated around South America, especially in upcoming elections, especially rejectionism towards the left specifically, since it's very dominating in South America right now? And well, second short question, I guess, is how do you guys see potential right-wing victory in Chile affecting US and Chile relations in the future? Thank you.
Michael, would you like to?
Yeah, well, in Uruguay, there's no rejectionist. Everything is the oasis of South America. So, you're immune from all that stuff in Uruguay. But for other normal Latin American countries, yeah, I think it's, I think that's, I mean, you could look back, not only today, but you could look back at, the emergence of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. What was he? He was a rejectionist of the old order that preceded him, where they had 2 lost decades in Venezuela. And Hugo Chavez was, I mean, that's what, you could look at it through that perspective rather than the prism of the left and the right. I think it's almost more powerful. It's not, I'm not saying ideology is irrelevant, but I think that's more important. So yeah, I think that continues. In Peru, it's going to be interesting, but in Peru, the government can be considered a government of the right, I think, rather than a leftist government. And I think if there's I think there could be continuity, or you could have a leftist, I mean, anything could happen in Peru. They have 44 candidates. Colombia, they have 108 registered. As of last 2 hours ago, there are probably more now, but they have 108 candidates registered in Colombia. Will there be a rejection of Petro in Colombia? I think that, maybe, but it's not quite clear. There are a lot of other factors at play. First of all, you need a good candidate. Candidates are not irrelevant. You need a good candidate to win. And, Petro in Colombia, I mean, there was a very good article in The Economist a couple of weeks ago that said, inflation is lower than it was when he took over. Unemployment is lower than it was when he took over. Certainly the security situation deteriorated. But there are a lot of other indicators. It's a mixed picture, basically. And he's got 30% support, which is more support than either Ivan Duque had at the end of the term or Juan Manuel Santos had at the end of the second term. It's higher than either of those two presidents. So, will it be rejection there? We don't know. It depends on the verdict of how people look at that situation. But I think, this is a sort of a thread. And obviously, when you have governments like AMLO's government was very popular and Scheinbaum, that's not a rejectionist. And Bukele was reelected, and because people are content. So, there you see, it's not because there's a continuity and you want to, but people are unhappy and you have the sense that the country's not going in the right direction, then, it's not an ideological shift. It's just, we want to change. We want something different. And I think that pattern is we're going to see more of that.
This is one of the things that we see in the news. Newscasters who haven't had much experience in Latin America are saying it's a red tide or a tide to the right.
Yeah.
And people that have experience with the region think that it's people feel that the government isn't working and it's a rejectionist vote overall. And I think it's an important distinction to make. This gentleman in the back,
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm a retired high-tech international business executive, ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, and one of the few people in the room who knows very little about Chilean politics. So for the benefit of us who are learning about this, I wonder, first of all, if anyone could explain any discussion about American elections would ultimately not be complete without some discussion of ethnic, racial, religious groups, Christian evangelicals, Latinos, whatever, and no discussion would be complete in most countries without some examination of the international geopolitics of, are we aligning with China? Are we aligning with the United States? Whatever. So my two questions are, first, are there ethnic, religious identity groups in Chile? And if there are, did they play and will they play any role in the elections of identity, sort of, this is the way Catholics vote or evangelicals? And secondly, did and will international geopolitics play any role in the elections that took place in, the elections that are coming on? Thanks.
well, Lisa, could you begin to answer that and also add gender as a category, since that's something you've worked on?
Yes, the question is very interesting because you have lots of support, for instance, in the south of Chile, in the region of the Araucanía, where the Mapuches, so that there is the most important presence of Mapuches, which is native group in Chile. The right wings, like by far. So because there is a lot of poverty also in that region. So maybe like the intuition would say something different, like you are from a native group or pueblo, but you vote for the right. In Chile, at least in the south, works like that. And that it connects with religious matters. José Antonio Cast present himself as a Catholic Christian candidate, Kaiser the same, and I don't, so there is the most conservative religious people will support them. I think in Chile we have still religious, non-conservative people, they will not support José Antonio Cast and Kaiser. But also you have an interesting division about Parisi that we were talking about. This guy, no facho ni comunacho, not the right nor the win. He has an enormous presence of support in the north of Chile, where the migration issue is like the big topic. So it's not religious, not ethnical, but it's geopolitical within the country. Like when you are more exposed to Peru, Bolivia, then Parisi, this guy that says, I'm not from the right, from the left, but I want order and I want the end of corruption. He has a huge speech about those terms. Then the geopolitical reference also appeared. And in the international one, it probably, if Cast wins, he will come to the US and take a picture with Trump or to Milei. In one of the debates in Chile, he was asked, who is your international political figure that you want to follow? And he said Meloni. But 3 years ago, he would have said Bukele, Trump, Milei. So again, Orban. Yeah, he used to say Orban, but now he said Meloni. So again, maybe he has this speech that I'm not them, but he has been following their career. He has gone to Salvador, Hungary. So let's see how it goes.
Eric, you cited the polls when you talked. Were there any, did the polls categorize people in a way that seems to indicate that the differences that the gentleman asked the question raised would matter in future elections?
I don't recall seeing polling that looked at the question of religious belief. But I think it is important to situate caste in part in the context of religious cleavages in Chile. I mean, he has presented himself over the course of his career as fundamentally about a very conservative Catholic identity. And though he didn't emphasize it, go out of his way to emphasize it in this campaign, certainly that historically has been central to his brand. It's also the case that religious identity in Chile has not been, and religious Catholic identity has not been associated exclusively with the right. To the contrary, during the dictatorship, the human rights movement was inspired in part by currents of progressive and not so progressive, but committed to human rights segments of the church, right? I think that if someone asked the question of what would be the response were cast to issue pardons to human rights violators, part of the response would come from Catholic human rights sectors, right? The one thing I would say, Lou, in response to your question on the polling, I'm struck that the polling seems to have been, that the predictions seem to have been right, that non-voters historically did tend to shift right. And I think it's also really interesting that the youth vote in Chile, like the youth vote in Argentina, has gone hard right. And that is very interesting 6 years after the youth social explosion, that this is the direction in which it's gone. But if you look at the under 30 vote, it's still really heavily right.
So it's one of the other things about voting is that more than 10% of the, or 20% of the ballots were blank or were rejected in one way or another. Furthermore, 10% of the population didn't vote overall. And many Chileans that I know have never voted, so they're not counted among the registered voters. So if you follow this Mexican model, there is an opportunity for politicians to mobilize people that have never been mobilized politically before and to play some kind of a force overall. And I throw that out not because I think it's going to happen in Chile, but there's other ways to think about the way political systems can be organized. On your international question, here in the United States, the narrative is always about this bipolar world, the United States and China competing. That's not the way it's seen in the rest of the world. In a country like Chile, people are more pragmatic and they reach out not just to China and to the United States, but also to Turkey and to South Africa and to Vietnam. Chile's very dependent on trade and reaches out to those countries to get the best deal it possibly can. So the international issue that concerns me that wasn't much discussed as far as I understand the election is regional cooperation. South America is one of the regions of the world that's least organized, and with complementarities among the nations, it's least used to create advantages for itself. If you compare it with Southeast Asia, there's a huge gap. And I don't remember seeing that as an issue that was brought up at all within the Chilean elections this time. It was more the domestic issues of migration and crime, which one can understand. How that issue could be brought up, I don't know, but each year, Latin America produces a smaller portion of the global product and engages in a smaller portion of global trade. That's a macro problem that Chile hasn't suffered from as much as the other nations, but that Chile does suffer from to some extent. We have time for 3 more questions. Let's ask them all together and then answer this lady there, this lady there, and this gentleman with the hat.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. My name is Maite. I am Chilean, and I lead our Chile programming at the Atlantic Council. My question is similar to what you asked. It was about the Chile-US relations and what you think could happen if Gast were to win versus Jara, and how that would play out.
Let's have this. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Grace, I'm an undergraduate student, School of Public Affairs. I was wondering more about how to, on this side. So I've been looking at polling recently, and with the runoff election next month, it looks like Hara has a voter motivation problem in that the polling seems to suggest that a lot of her voters aren't going to turn out again to vote for her again, even though she did win, albeit by 2 points. She did like get the plurality this time. Do you think that there's some way that she could maybe make use of the voter base who hasn't voted before, or try to draw some people from the middle who might not want to turn out again? Or is she kind of just stuck and has to accept that this probably isn't going to work out?
Last question, this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Oscar Gillette. I'm a history student here at American University. Professor I was surprised to hear that our economists tend to lean to the right in Chilean politics. Admittedly, my only background on them is reading about their battle tactics like centuries ago against the Spaniards, so I don't know anything about them today, but that surprised me. Do you think there's any hope that communists could get a pickup there, maybe by leaning into like anti-colonial rhetoric or like material economic issues, like where not going away, or do you think that's like not a possibility?
Lisa, would you like to go across the three for final comments?
Yeah, about the US. I think that Janet Jara probably would be very pragmatic about the US. I don't think she would make like a personal issue. She's not like the communist anti-American. I think she would like to have stabilized economy. Chile has a huge really commercial relationship with the US. So probably she would be more pragmatic about the relationship. And on the contrary, I think if Kat wins, maybe it will we will see like an ideological connection. Not a dependency as Argentina, who need the US in order to have economic stability. I think Chile probably is struggling as all the countries all around the world now because of tariffs, but its internal economy is more stabilized. But I think as I said before, probably the first trip that he would do abroad, I would say it would be here to have a picture with Trump. But Latin America for Trump, it's like not an issue really, apart from Venezuela, narco. Well, it's maybe yeah, but all the others, we don't as Latin Americans, we feel that we are considered more like a threat than an ally. So that maybe would change that, would like to be more like an ally than a threat.
Final comments and answers?
I guess with regard to your question, the SPA student, my sense is that Jara during the campaign will have to call attention to this is what Kast says he would do. Do you really want that? And I think that will actually gain her some votes. I still don't think it's going to add up to 50%. But I think that around the social questions, around gender, around social programs, I think they're going to hammer home. This is who Kast says he is. Right? And I don't think that there's a majority in the Chilean electorate that would actually favor the policies that Kast has associated himself with historically, and that I would add again, is from the exchange with the economic policy advisor, that his economic policy team was talking about. That's just not going to cut it with the majority of the Chilean electorate.
Michael, final comments?
Yeah, well, first of all, on Janet Jara, she might want to be pragmatic, but I'm not sure from this for here. I mean, she's a member of the Communist Party. So pragmatism is out the window from this end, not from her end. I don't think that she'd get much traction, with this administration just by virtue of being a member of the Communist Party. However, I don't, like I said, I would be very, very surprised if she were to to win. And I think with Cass, yeah, you're gonna see a greater affinity with the Trump administration. I think you're right. You probably want to get a photo taken. But I also think you'd want to be, my sense is that you also want to be, careful not to become another Malay who basically, is in total lockstep with everything Trump, every single thing the US does. I think they would want to be, and there'd be some pressure within Chile to have some degree of, autonomy, some degree of decision making to look at what's actually in Chile's national interest rather than saying whatever the US does, we're just going to follow it, which is what Malay is basically doing. That's the definition of his foreign policy. So I think he's going to, want to get close, but also not want to be kind of completely subordinate to everything that the United States does. And I think if he does choose that, I think that would have some costs for him politically in Chile. I don't think that's, I think there's some pride in kind of the Chilean, national interest that we could, and sovereignty and all those issues are still very present. So but clearly he's going to be an alliance. Look at the Bolivian case that Lou mentioned, Rodrigo Paz in Bolivia. My sense is that, clearly there's a shift from the 20 years of, Mas rule in Bolivia. But I also think Paz is going to have to be very sensitive in how far he moves into the kind of the Trump, US camp as well, because there could be fallout and reactions within Bolivia. And it's not quite the same as Chile, but I do think he'll want to sort of be able to maintain some independence from the United States. That would be my guess, while at the same time coming for the photo and all of that and trying to get any benefits from the US, but also not being in lockstep with whatever this administration decides to do, which is what we see in Argentina.
If teenage behavior is any kind of prediction, Paz was a very reasonable student who did very well at SIS and he was an undergraduate. So I'd like to thank the three panelists, really great answers. And